Knock, knock. Control freak. Now you say control freak too. So what was wrong with this joke, besides it being lame? What was wrong with this joke? Say it again. Oh, I thought you said it was out of order. I thought that's what I heard the first time. What's wrong with that joke?
You didn't follow protocol. I
didn't follow the pattern, right? What am I supposed to say? Knock, knock. Who's there? Orange, you glad I didn't. Yeah, you know. So you know, there's a pattern, right? I didn't follow the expected routine. And if you think about it, in our lives, there are a lot of patterns, formulas, and traditions that shape how we interact with those around us, right? For example, if I'm out on the street and I wave at somebody, what do they usually do back? They usually wave back, even if they don't know who I am, which is kind of the fun part. They do it just because it's expected. If you come up to me this morning and you say good morning, what might I say back to you? Good morning. If I tell you that it is my birthday today, what might you say? Happy birthday. Yeah, and so we have patterns, we have customs, we have social norms that help us know how to act and interact and respond appropriately within our communities. Something that struck me, though, is as I was looking at last week's gospel lesson and this week's gospel lesson from Matthew, Jesus seems to ignore many of the world's rules and standards for discussion and debate. Last week, the chief priests and elders asked Jesus a question. All right? When you ask somebody a question, what do you usually expect to get back? Answer, right? And Jesus responds with another question. This week, Jesus tells a parable. And then he asks the chief priests and the Pharisees a question about it. They play along and they follow the social pattern and they answer Jesus' question. What I found interesting was that Jesus neither affirms nor rebukes their answer. Sure, the chief priests and the Pharisees assume they know what the story means and what the answer is. And yet Jesus never tells them if they're right or wrong, which is usually the way that questions work, right? And I don't know about you, but I, for one, would love to know what the right answer is about this story that Jesus tells. I mean, if you think about it, it's a really chilling and a haunting story. It's not a real baptism-friendly story. I was like, come on. A landowner leaves a group of tenants in charge of his vineyard, right? When he sends his servants to collect the rent, what happens? You get beaten, stoned, and killed. And so what is the landowner's response? Does the landowner then call the police? Does he arm his servants? He sends another group of them. And what happens to them? Same thing, violence. Now, does the landowner respond with cruise missiles and drone strikes? No. The landowner then sends his own son to these bloodthirsty tenants. And they still don't care. They kill the owner's son. Pure madness, pure evil. And we know all too well about madness and evil and violence, right? We saw it on our TVs and computer screens as a man last week murdered scores of concert goers. We hear madness from a leader that's developing nuclear weapons and rockets while his own people starve. We remember terrorists mowing down tourists with a heavy truck. When will it end, Lord? How do we stop the madness? How do we stop the violence? How do we end the evil? And too often I find myself and those around me coming to the same solution that the Pharisees and the chief priests come to when they heard about these wicked tenants. Put those wretches to a miserable death. We know all too well how to answer death with death, violence with violence. We continue to be the only developed democracy in this world that shows how evil and wrong killing is by putting somebody to death for killing someone. It's crazy. It's mad. The United States has enough nuclear weapons, the same nuclear weapons that we are desperate to keep out of the hands of other countries. We have enough of them to destroy the earth 5 times over. That's mad. That's crazy. And yet we say to ourselves that we have to have these things. Sometimes we have to hit back when we are bullied, right? Sometimes we have to shoot back when we're attacked, right? Sometimes we have to strike back when we're struck first. Sometimes we have to riot in the streets and commit acts of violence because we're being oppressed, right? Right, Jesus? We know the right answer, and sometimes it entails force and violence. Except Jesus and God stay silent when we make our claims for the necessity and justice of violence in certain circumstances. There are patterns, right? You do this to me, I do that back to you. And we have to know that this is not an exercise in abstraction. We and others that we love have been hurt, have even been killed. When is the appropriate time and place for violence? Jesus came feeding hungry people, forgiving people who are desperate for forgiveness, and healing sick people. Jesus came teaching us a new way of living and being. And the political rulers, the religious leaders, and the crowds beat him, whipped him, crucified him, and killed him. And we finally get the answer to Jesus' parable, right? What happens when they kill the beloved son? How will God respond? And we wait 3 days for our deserved hellfire and brimstone. But we get something different than what we expect, than what we deserve. We get an empty tomb. We get new life instead of death, and a promise that death is no longer the end. The vineyard owner responds to greed, violence, and sin with the resurrection. Finally, we get Jesus' answer. The old patterns, the old ways, the old customs of revenge and violence are over. And in our baptisms, like Scarlett's in a few minutes, we are given and commissioned into a new pattern of life, a new way of living, a new way of being. Who here is tired of the violence? Who here is tired of feeling anger? Who here is tired of the need of revenge, the desire to tear somebody else down physically or verbally? This is not who we are. This is not who we were created to be. Christians and the church are called to be strange. We are called to be weird. We are called to live differently from the expected patterns of our world. We are called to answer death and violence with life. This is why this week we hosted a Narcan workshop here at our church, and we now have a kit in our AED box out here to reverse overdoses if needed. The world might say, well, but they're an addict. They did it to themselves. We see them as someone's granddaughter, someone's brother, someone's friend. And we will offer life in the face of death. This is why we plant and tend the community garden behind Lafayette School, despite vandalism, despite heroin needles, because we believe that life is stronger than death. This is why our women's group is assembling sleeping mats for the homeless made out of plastic bags. The world has given up on many of these people, on many of our brothers and sisters, and we choose to offer life. How will you embody these new patterns of life this week, rather than the old expected pattern of death and violence? How will you use your words this week, in person and online? How will you respond when someone slights you or cuts you off on the road? How will you stand with the kid getting picked on at school or out in the sports field? Know that we will mess up. We will fail. We'll revert back to those old patterns and ways of being. Absolutely. But we don't have to stay there. We have access to the same gift as scarlet. Through water and the Word, we are assured of our value and God's forgiveness so that we can try once again and again and again to live into the new life of Christ that surpasses and replaces the old life of death. Thanks be to God and amen.